It's a very somber moment in the journey of our republic. Uh, uh, Labor, with all the oppression that they suffer, have surrounded us right through the journey of our republic. But never has their suffering been as visible and as poignant and as it is at this moment. And I think that yeah, this is a moment for us, all of you on this panel, and we're all very privileged to have you together this morning, this afternoon, depending on which part of the world you are in, to join us in in this conversation, because we we absolutely must ensure that in the weeks and months which follow, and on the other side of this pandemic, because there has to be another side, we ensure that all the all the feelings in securing uh, the rights of elementary justice uh, that uh, that we have failed our workers with all of this while is remedied to some degree, or to as much as it can be. So we'll go through a round of conversations. As I said, this is the finest group that one could gather. You bring various kinds of experiences and reflections and years and years and years of work. And we want to hear from you. And I thought that before we look at the present, we do need to look at the past, uh, because uh, because we haven't come here suddenly or by chance. We've come here because that is how the situation of workers in this country has been and remained over the past decades, particularly the workers in informal work. We are here because not because of the pandemic, this unprecedented humanitarian crisis, which many of us believe is probably going to be the worst humanitarian crisis that all of us will witness during our lifetimes. Uh, this has not occurred because of the pandemic. It has occurred because of policy choices made uh, for decades, and the policy choices made to fight the pandemic. So I wanted us to to really step back and say what are, in your opinion, what is it that has resulted in this profound uh, uh, failure to be able to provide any kind of protection and rights to our workers when they most needed it. And one of the things that I've been talking with some friends on this panel itself, with like Ravi and Kanan, who couldn't join us. You know, uh, Prabhat Patnaik, Joyati, Ghosh, and I, we put out a couple of articles where we said that the first thing that we have to do is to ensure, just like the middle class is assured wages through every day uh, of the pandemic, because they are forced to stay at home. Likewise, every single worker should be given 7,000 rupees per household and a certain amount of grain. But the even if the government, and it's a very very big if the government had even agreed to that uh, to that suggestion, in rural India, we at least have some kind of a framework. We do have thanks to the NREJ, we have job cards, we have pensioners, we have people with bank accounts. So if the government had resolved, it could have transferred these resources. But in urban India, actually, even if it had resolved to do it, how would it do it? It doesn't have a list, even a list of who the informal workers are. They're not registered with the government because they have never extended any kind of labor protection to them, and they've never intended to. And only 17% of workers in the informal sector have an identifiable employer. So what happens to the rest? So this crisis, and actually when we were writing this article, we ultimately felt that if the government was to do it, the only way it could actually do it was by using indelible ink of the kind that we use in elections, and would have people to present themselves, uh, take the cash and the grain and have indelible ink. I mean, this kind of abdication where the state doesn't even have even the elementary information about the workers, let alone any kind of protection of their rights as workers and their social security. What has brought us to this pass? We have many laws. We have the Interstate Migrant Workers Act. We have the Contract Workers Act. We have various other laws. We have the Building and Construction Workers Acts, etc. The quick surveys that we have done found that most workers are not even if you are construction workers, you're not registered. So I wanted you to, wanted to ask each of the panelists, where is it that we have gone so wrong? Is it in the design of our legal framework of rights? Is it in the implementation? Is it in state bias of the ruling class? Uh, where have we gone wrong? Is what gone so terribly wrong? Is the question that I wanted to raise before all of you. And Jon Breman, who we are particularly privileged to have on this panel, he's done more work than the lifetimes of many of the people who will be listening to him on the conditions of workers in India. So, Jon, where have we gone wrong?
Thanks, Harsh, and it's nice to see many familiar faces to discuss these issues. But before going into the question of where have we gone wrong, and it's not of the last couple of years that question is addressed. I first want to put forward the magnitude of the people we are talking about at vulnerability. And even that question, an elementary question, how many of the people are not only threatened by the pandemic, but threatened already for many years in their way of life, in their human quality. What is the magnitude we are talking about? And even that simple question, that elementary question, is not known. A few of us were discussing already before the start of this panel about the number of footloose people on the road, trying to reach home, chased away, but also wanting to go away now to where they belong or are supposed to belong. We do not know. There are estimates varying from 4 crores to 10 crores to 15 crores. And that shows this question of who the people are, where they are, how they have gone there, and why they are going back now. And at least, and that is highlighted by the pandemic, they have become visible all of a sudden, while they were an unknown quantity. So that question is important because it brings up the total lack of care handed out to them, to which they are, as citizens, they would have a right, the total lack of care, the indifference, but also the unwillingness to come to their relief at this moment or critical in their life. Their life has, as I said, been critical before, but now more so than ever. That's my first answer to your question, Harsh.
So much, Jon. Ravi, looking even closer at law and policy and where we have gone wrong there, really looking back, why have we faltered so badly, and where have we faltered so badly?
Harsh, well, thanks for bringing me into this discussion and this issue of where we have faltered so badly. Given that we have such an extensive labor law framework, and this going back centuries now, at least as far as the formal sector is concerned. But of course, there is also a huge set of laws which deal with unorganized sector workers. So why is it that we have failed to cover? Why is it that we fail to provide a modicum of decent regulation for the workers? I think there are two reasons for this. First of all, the one thing I would like to say is that whenever we talk about labor in India, you cannot demarcate between the social question in India and the question of labor in India. Just as you cannot demarcate also you cannot only talk about the question of labor in India decontextualized from the economic policy regimes. So I think at both levels, you need to talk about the social question, you need to talk about the economic questions. When you talk about the social questions, the issue of caste, gender, minorities, ethnic identities becomes so vitally important. The recognition of the fact that we are so deeply hierarchical and so deeply discriminatory that we don't really care about classes of labor. And I think that is the situation in which we have existed from all times. That is not a situation where we have been able to move away from, despite whatever pattern of capitalist development, whatever pattern of development that we've had in this country. So the fact that we are able to treat all kinds of indignities of labor, that we do not actually imbue labor with human dignity. We don't imbue physical labor with any kind of human dignity at all. And of course, if it is dirty labor, if it is polluting labor, then of course it is the most indignified form of labor. So I think we in India, and labor policy is only a part of how we socially structure ourselves. We are used to dealing with invisibilized labor at the bottom of the pyramid. We have never really created institutions. We are a great country. Harsh, irrespective of the conundrum that you faced in terms of how do we give handouts to workers, I believe that the Indian state is an amazing state because it can deliver under most complex situations. You know, its power. I come from a town called Allahabad, now Prayagraj, where we deal with this religious congregation year after year. And in some years, we deal with this congregation where on days that we are able to deal with 20, 30 million people coming into the city on a single day and leaving safely. Except for 2 years, 1954 and I think 1992, 1991, there has never ever been, an accident of any kind. So we have an extraordinary past, but we can, the fact that we do not exercise this in favor of classes of people and those who individualize is a case in point. That's the first thing. Secondly, if you also superimpose the pattern of capitalist development, the pattern of development that we've had in India since independence, but accelerated after neoliberalism, after 1991, a lot of the story, Jan's story, Jan, who has been somebody I've learned from the very beginning that I started working on rural transformation, he tells a story of rural transformation and change and of labor from the 1960s itself. And that's a very long span. But I think the story of labor transformed in specific ways after 1991 with liberalization. And we do need to understand that the Indian state started liberalizing a phase of liberalizing labor laws more de facto than de jure, dealing with the states rather than the center. And the net result of that is that labor markets informalize. I have made this argument in a number of places in two papers, which I wrote for the ILO and another my presidential paper in the Indian Society of Labor Economics, that the heart of the Indian economy was hollowed out from 90s onwards, and with accelerating space in this century, so that the organized, the formal sector of the economy itself became informalized. I think our audience should know the fact that even at the beginning of this century, 73% of organized sector manufacturing in this country was already informal, and that increased to 77% in 2017-18. The organized service sector, which was technically the most formal part of the economy, was 33% informal in 2004-5 and became 52% informal in 2017-18. If you look at the growth of over the last 15-20 years, we had a declining agricultural employment, but this was matched by very slow rate of growth of formal employment. Basically, it was informal employment which has grown in this country, and it grew under within the rubric of the labor laws that we have. The labor laws did not afford any protection to any section of labor, either within the formal sector of the economy or within the informal sector of the economy. And this happened much before the nature of the state. We still have a neoliberal state under this government, but the nature of the state has, of course, changed very much. We have a much harder state, a state which believes that which believes that the courts will do its bidding, that it does not need to worry about laws. It can put anything on the statute books, or even if it doesn't put anything on the statute book, and that is the condition that we see with the labor codes. I guess we should talk about it more later on, but that's also we see with the latest changes that have been made at the state level in labor laws. So you are absolutely right. The changes started occurring much earlier. We did not have a modicum of regulation for unorganized sector workers, but over the last 20 to 30 years, it is the organized sector of the economy which has become informalized. And finally, I just want to make the point, which I think all of us realize. Jan has said this repeatedly over the last 30 years. I have said this over the last 20 years. Informality and migration and circular migration in India have gone hand in hand. The growth into informality in India is due to the growth of circular migration in India, both short-term and long-term circular migration. The bulk of informal labor in India are today migrants. They are circular migrants, either short-term migrants or long-term migrants. Circularity and informality have gone hand in hand, and they coexist with discrimination in labor market segmentation. So I think these are the characteristics which within which we have to look at the changes in labor law and the conditions of labor in this country.
Thank you, Ravi. I think that, you made many valuable points as always. But one that one I especially agree with is that the Indian state does not lack capacity. It's not a state without capacity, because what it chooses to do, it does very well. I've been part of the IAS. I know how much of competence and caliber there is when they set out to do something. And so the denial, the systematic, comprehensive denial of rights to workers in the informal sector is not a failure of the state. It is part of what the state consciously wants to do and does not want to do. So I think that's a very valuable point. Also, how much of this is intrinsic to the nature of neoliberal capitalism, and that growth has always been accompanied by more and more informalization, and informalization has been linked more and more with short and long-term circular migration. I think these are all really valuable insights that you have offered us. I move now to Renana. Renana, I don't see you. I hope you're still here. But Renana is somebody, not only I, but a lot of us have held in very high esteem. Seva is a formidable organization which has worked with very large numbers of women workers in organizing them, and with years and years of your experience. Again, the same question: why has the state so profoundly and comprehensively failed its informal workforce, and particularly women.
Okay. Well, first, thank you, Harsh, for inviting me to this webinar. And this is something that one feels very strongly about, and especially now looking at how the callousness with which workers are being dealt, and how the new labor laws, I know we're going to talk about that, but the intent of the government and the employers is to put all the anything that is to revive has to be on the backs of the workers, making them even more miserable than they are now. But we'll come back to that. Anyway, my point was one feels very strongly about this. I don't want to repeat what Ravi has said, but I just say that over the years, one has seen the real informalization of workers. Of course, there was always a very big informal workforce, but it has become even more informal. And the mechanism has been through contractors and casualization. And this whole contractor way of working, or this casual way of working, is the way of working where you don't recognize the worker at all. And so identifying the worker, who he or she is, where does she live, what is a phone number, what is a bank account, none of that is important. So it's just a mass of, as far as the employers are concerned, it's just a mass of unidentified labor. And that is the problem that, of course, now has come up because they're all unidentified. I'd like to give one or two specific issues. First is what we have been working, which is especially a women's area, which is the home-based workers, women who work from their homes, making things on the piece rate for often very large employers, often even multinationals, but through a whole list of, a whole chain of contractors. And of course, they get very little at the end of that. The piece rate is much lower than the minimum wage. They often don't get their payments and so on. And we had this long discussion with very large employers and with the contractors that at least let's recognize these workers. Let's see who they are, what kind of work they're doing, and whether they're even getting whatever piece rate they're entitled to. And in fact, we made a whole manual of that with the employers. And of course, much to our disappointment, but I guess to be expected, nobody took any notice of it, because they wanted to keep them unidentified. So this desire to keep them as an unidentified mass, I think that is the basis of what we are seeing today. I want to talk about one more thing, which is the bill. We talked about laws. I want to focus in on this Building and Contract Workers Act, at least the Building and Contract Workers Fund. Now, there are these huge funds. To this day, have not been able to understand why these huge funds, 1,000 crores, I think over 1,000 crores, 1,200 crores in Delhi alone, another 1,000 crores in Gujarat, similarly MP, similarly in many of the states, 800 crores I know in Punjab. The money is just lying there. They spend 10% of the money. Why? Because they do not want to identify the construction labor. Had they today identified the full mass of construction labor, which could easily have been done, the cash transfers to them would have been very easy. And construction workers are one of the main migrants who are walking home because the money is there, the money is supposed to be for them, it cannot be spent on anything else, but you don't identify them, you don't give it to them. And a third group, which we haven't been talking about, is what is called the self-employed. And these are very much part of the informal sector. They are both in the rural and urban, areas. They are often part of ancillary industry, so they're dependent on industry. Sometimes they're independent like street vendors. And again, unlike MSMEs, which are identified, these very small micro enterprises or survivalist self-employed are again unidentified. So this whole issue of identity, I think, comes up again and again. And finally, I'd like to say that if we had the system of proper cash transfers, we could have, of course, depending on the intent of the government, but the method of supporting this very large labor, even if it isn't identified by labor, if it was just, if we had a sort of basic income for the lowest 60%, we could have today really saved this huge migration. But I think it started off well, Jan Dhan accounts were made, and after that, the whole idea of cash transfers was forgotten. So I think the two ways, the identification and the possibility of some form of basic income, if either of those were in place, or if both of those were in place, then we could have avoided this huge tragedy that is happening today.
Thank you, Renana. I think that, once again, you have underlined that the fact that we don't have a record of the workers is because we've chosen not to have a record of the workers, because the employers in close cohorts with the state have deliberately not wanted a record of the workers, because it would have created responsibilities for the rights of those workers then that would ensue from their registration. And I think that is a really important and powerful point. And when we look to the future, how do we ensure that in future this invisible mass of workers who are available like a tap, when you want them you put it on, and when you don't want them you just switch it off, and you don't have any further responsibility towards them, how can that change in the reality of workers, I think is really important. You also talked about cash transfers, and if you believe that if cash transfers had already there would have been a system of cash transfers, there would have been at least a vehicle to reach the workers in their time of greatest distress. I come now to Atul, again a very dear friend like everyone else on this panel, but much more than that, somebody who's devoted himself to think about these issues, and I'm sure he would also talk about the relationship. I mean, some of the reasons for these failures being located in the nature of the economic system that we run and the nature of our state. But over to you, Atul, please.
Okay. Thank you, Harsh, for asking me to join this important conversation. And I will also like to add that I agree with the way you framed the issue, and as well as my co-panelists who have given their ideas about how to look at the current issue. May I suggest that the key question that you've been asking, Harsh, is where has the Indian state failed? I would just like to also add a sub-question to it: where have we failed? In the sense that it's not only that the state has failed, but in terms of the way we were conceptualizing the state itself, and the point that Professor Breman and Ravi has underlined, that the state itself has gone through a transformation. And if we acknowledge the fact that the state itself has gone through a transformation, then our engagement with the state on the question of labor also needs to be modified in the light of that. And I think, as you said, it's a somber moment, and it's time also for us to maybe step back a little and see, how we have been engaging with the state, and should we be considering some of the aspects of how we have been engaging with it. May I suggest that in many ways, it would not be inappropriate to argue that the typically, sort of defined this phase of Indian state as a developmentalist state has come to an end. I mean, we all acknowledge what had happened in 91 and so on and so forth. But clearly, Indian state has recrafted and reconstructed itself in a manner where it wants to, and the title of today's conversation was before COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. And I think there is a strong element of connect between how the Indian state has been looking at the question of labor on all these three fronts, that is pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. And the state has been very consistent in how it is looking at the question of labor and labor in general. In the imagining of the so-called lockdown, without going into the question of whether lockdown was essential or not, or and so on and so forth, I think in that imagining of lockdown, there was no imagining of labor. It was an imagining only about people who are, like us, who had possibilities of this physical distance and so on and so forth. Everyone understands that context here. So this absence of imagining at the time of the lockdown continues even now. And I think it is very intentional. Many of the panelists have said that the intent of the state is changed, and there's this lack of empathy. But again, I think the state has been consistent on that front. To sort of specifically address the question that you've been asking, I don't see an issue, this as what we are experiencing now, as an issue of the failure of the legislation or the failure of the documentation of the, because everyone who's sitting here, we all know the reality of India's labor based on the sources of information that the government of India provides. Apart from our own specific field-based research. And it's very clear, Ravi has written, Professor Breman, there's so much substantive literature to suggest what are the key characteristics of India's labor market. Everyone knows we're talking about the informality. We also know it's not only the informality, but how migrant labor has been the key component of it. We also know where migrant labor is involved. We also know how migratory labor or migrant labor moves. So I think in terms of the knowledge and understanding of what is happening in the labor market is very much available with us. So A, it's neither the failure of law. B, I don't think it's a failure of information and understanding. None of these is the key factor which is responsible. And if I may add, for extending from the conversation we just had, I also don't see so much an issue of record and documentation. In fact, the state, Indian state, is actually at the moment busy in destroying the documentation and evidence it has. In a sense that in sectors of labor market where it has record, it does not want to maintain record. It does not want to keep the record. So clearly the state is not interested. I think the key question would be for us to ask is, how does the state manage to get away with what is happening currently? The humongous human tragedy that this country is facing, how is it possible that the Indian state in these times is able to implement its agenda of actually deregulating capital? It has successfully re-regulated labor. It has worked and crafted the labor as it wanted. And now it's also making changes, because if you look at the announcements made in the past 5 days, clearly the emphasis is to deal with substantive reform, whatever you want to call it, reform 2.0, reform 4.0, whatever is the fashionable expression. But in a sense, the emphasis is in terms of what it wanted to do before. So the state is busy doing the same. Now the question, as I'm suggesting, is, should we be doing the same? And my humble submission is that perhaps not. I think this is the time where we, rather than focus on looking at the categories of labor, which is important, and we have a very good knowledge base of that, but there is also a commonality of experience of labor, which COVID has brought in front of us. In fact, the suffering of labor is across the board, with of course some differences in the extent. But I've been sort of going around in the industrial areas of where I live, and whether you are looking at big industries or informal industries and so on and so forth, there is a huge element of commonality in the experience of labor. We also note that even those who are working in so-called organized sector with some kind of relative protection did not get any protection. And the reason for it is not only because the government orders were not implementable, but the government itself has been busy for the last decade or so telling us that it actually doesn't want to regulate. It wants to give up its capacity to influence and regulate. It wants to actually give it to the employer and the, and the factory owner. So the state has been busy diluting its capacity. So suddenly, at a point when we have the crisis of this mammoth proportion, I mean, where is the state's capacity going to come back to regulate? The state, and the announcements of the labor law changes again expresses state's intent that it wants to give up its capacity. So the state, as far as labor and the working people is concerned, does not want. I mean, Ravi was mentioning about that this state has that capacity is very selectively used. I mean, it doesn't want to use its capacity. So whether we talk about the vulnerable sections in terms of creating documentation for the construction workers, but actually the government is actually wanting that rest of the workers also become undocumented in the way that the construction workers are undocumented. I don't think that the state was not aware, Harsh, when you filed that PIL, I don't think that the state was, not aware that, how 85 to 90% of the construction workers were not registered with the welfare system, and therefore would not be eligible to seek those benefits. So what I'm suggesting is that the state had full information. It knew what the condition of the labor market is. If you look at the PLFS survey, which is brought out by the government of India, 2017-18, there's a clear characterization of the nature of India's labor market and the condition of India's labor force. It knew that if you look at the self-employed, there is about 50% of the self-employed which does not make minimum wages, which doesn't make 9,700 rupees in a month. It knows what were the rural wages and urban wages. It knew what were the differences between the wages of men and women. So the absence of saving with the workforce to deal with few hours of lockdown was well known to the Indian state. It's not that it did not know that they had no money to survive on their own for even 2 days, that they would need food as soon as they are taken away from their earnings. This was very much part of the knowledge base. So what I'm suggesting is that it's intentional. I mean, I'm not saying the suffering is intentional, but the perspective through which the state has seen the lockdown and the construction of the post-lockdown society and economy is very much well thought out. And we'll have to be asking ourselves that how do we deal with a state whose basic character has changed, who is not going to be, responding to the kind of, very well worked out schemes and programs that we have been seeking. We'll have to think of other modalities of building pressures of the state. And my suggestion is that modality, the key feature of that modality would be to talk about the commonality of experience of labor. And to bring together this commonality as a mechanism to work as pressure for the state to respond. Because if we sort of start looking at labor in terms of these multiple categories at this moment and seek their documentation, then it essentially boils down to issues of implementation. While we are very, as everyone has said, that is essentially not an issue of implementation, but it's a much deeper issue embedded in the nature of growth strategy that we have chosen. Professor Breman is here, and he's wonderfully argued in his years of research how the nature of urban growth and the peri-urban growth and how the informality is embedded in this growth strategy. So the informality, vulnerability, and precarity is embedded in the growth options we have chosen. And our expectation that the state will now be suddenly becoming empathetic and respond to this humongous human crisis, I don't think we will get the kind of response we are expecting unless we think of other ways of bringing this commonality of experience of labor.
So Atul, I think that, once again, you've underlined what all of us are saying in one way or the other. It is not a failure of legislation. It's not a failure of understanding and information. It's not even, you say, a failure of documentation. It's intrinsic to the character of the state. And also, you raised the question somewhere, how and why have we allowed the state to get away with this? This way, I thought we would spend a lot of time in this section of the conversation looking at specific laws,
and what was wrong with the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, what was wrong with this other act. But I think all of you are saying very, very clearly that it's not the letter of the legislation which is at fault. It is the character of the state and the character of the ruling class. And one has to see like the state to be able to understand why we are in this situation today. And that's a really worrying observation. How do we go from here is something that we'll talk at the latter part of today's discussion. I bring in here Priyanka Jain, who works with Ajivika Bureau, which has done a huge amount of really valuable both direct work on the ground with workers, informal workers, and large and substantially circular migrants, but also very front end kind of research. So Priyanka, how would you respond to the question, where have we gone wrong?
I do agree about the point about commonality of labor, but because this pandemic sort of also catapulted into imagination the particular kind of situation, location of migrant workers, I'd like to sort of delve into that a little bit more. What we saw during the pandemic, was a complete criminalization of their existence overall. So as a migrant worker, you can't be out on the streets of a city to buy your ration, to even protest. You will be lathi charged. You can't be walking on the highway, the police will stop you. You can't even go further from the state borders of your home state, the police will stop you there as well and send you back. If you do manage to reach your village somehow, there are state officials standing there to beat you up as well, unless you kind of go through the forests. This kind of suspension, complete statelessness, is not, like you were saying, it's not an anomaly. It's not something that has come out of nowhere. It has a very strong connection with a kind of deeper neurosis that sort of exists. And the genesis of this, as I think a lot of other people have argued, comes from our larger approach in economic planning. It is also about the way we have implemented labor laws or not implemented labor laws and the state intent, etc. But I'd like to kind of further unpack two particular points, which I think relate to this sort of suspension that we saw very starkly during the pandemic. One is and it relates to the migrants' relationship to state and society. What is their particular position in India's highly unequal labor markets, and what is their relationship to governance, particularly urban governance? Now, I think as far as circular migrants are concerned, and this is again something that a lot of the panelists over here have spoken about, the marked or perhaps the more distinct feature about their vulnerability is that you are sort of kept desperate. So it's not, migrant workers work in formal and informal industries, in small scale as well as in large scale factories. But it is the same everywhere. It's not like labor laws do not, are not applicable to them at all. In fact, there are a lot of labor laws that do apply to them. They are not followed, the large scale violations. What we find is a certain sub-market which is created. There is a certain ghettoization in the Indian labor market where there are norms, not laws. And what is the sole logic of these norms? It is to be as extractive as possible of the laboring body of a migrant worker in terms of length of day, intensity of work, and abandoning every possible basic cost that an employer is supposed to bear of labor. And what that does is it makes sure that the migrant worker and the migrant household is intergenerationally reproduced in that particular format. Is never able to claim any kind of basic hold which allows them to come out of this trap. And that is why we see migrant labor in the sort of situations that we saw, also because when they are in the city, and if we look at urban governance, they are in a state of complete alienation in the city. When we started working with urban governance in the last few years, we kind of began thinking that maybe urban local bodies don't know where migrant workers are because they're not in the slums, and the imagination of the urban poor is restricted to slums. They live inside of factories, they live inside of construction sites, they live inside of pipes, completely sort of unrecognized areas. And so our work sort of began with the idea that we need to get the urban local bodies to recognize and to see these people. And it was, in fact, something that was important to do. But the more we investigated and the more we kind of came to understand the logic with which urban governance worked, what we realized is that there is a very clear intention behind not providing basic services to migrants inside of cities, circular migrants, because it fears that it will lead to claim building on their part. There is fear that they will start claiming the resources of the city, start settling down over there. So a lot of people in the municipalities and officials will tell us that if we provide them water, if we provide them toilets, and if we provide them food, they will not go back. And that's not a risk we can take. Being able to claim your foothold in the city is how the urban poor, the semi-settled, the more settled forms of migration were able to sort of come out or were able to negotiate the city. That is not something that seasonal circular migrants have had, they were ever in the position to do, and that was very, very intentional. That's something that a lot of evidence from other cities, like from Delhi and from Bombay, also suggests, you know, that you're not given services for a very particular reason. And that creates the kind of statelessness and suspension, which was what was amplified at this particular point. I think the kind of openings or shifts that have happened at this particular moment that I think are important is, first of all, their injury has become very visible. Not that these didn't exist before. Yes, they were amplified at this particular moment, but it was latent in how we function. But it has become a lot more visible now. There's a lot more consciousness around it. There was a lot more pressure on governments and states to do something about it, even though these kind of conditions have existed before. And it has led to, like, you know, the spate of all of these announcements as far as food is concerned, ration card is concerned, housing is concerned, etc. And there are also arbitrary measures right now to just kind of, like, you know, register migrant workers at bus stops and railway stations. And I think we kind of need to treat them as openings, but also be incredibly careful because the state has made its intentions of using all information to control labor, to control the movement of labor, to impinge on their freedom of movement, and to largely see them as a factor of production, as something that they need to come back to kind of address industry's labor shortage. So how do we use the openings of the moment to push our agendas of universality, rights, labor rights, etc., but not play into the very clear tendencies of the current regime to use every bit of information to control the life of labor? And this is something that even the industry is talking about today. So I'll stop there for now.
So you talked about many things, Priyanka, but you talked firstly about the criminalization of workers. And I'm just last night, I was out with some younger colleagues. We were trying to, reach out to migrants who were walking. And, there was a look in the eye of the migrants I spoke to who kept looking around. They were like fugitives from the law. They were like people who were committing a huge crime and were hiding from the state because all they wanted to do was to get home. And it's a look that will, I think, haunt me for a lifetime. Because we have reduced, hardworking, oppressed workers into fugitives because all they want to do is to have the dignity of going to a place they call home. You also talked about the whole premise of keeping desperate, and I think that is very, the whole strategy is to keep them desperate, not allow them to develop roots. Because the moment you develop roots in the city, and the moment you also have a regular place of employment where you can start asserting, organizing, I think that is really and that is again, you're underlining that is not by chance, it is a design. Indrajit, we come right at the end to you, not last but not least. Indrajit's been a very thoughtful scholar, and with the CS, and when he was in Oxford, we conducted a very rare kind of research, which was an ethnography for a year with migrants, with a group of migrants who moved out of a set of villages in Bihar to different parts of the country. And through those insights, what you're seeing today, Indrajit, what would you like to say?
Thanks, Harsh. I think the ethnographic work was an eye-opener in many ways, and it obviously helps us to also, in some ways, in the findings resonate with some of the things that have been said already. I think the most important aspect we need to consider, and it's a point that I think was made earlier on, is the social distance, and I use this word very reservedly, social distance that exists between migrant workers and the state. There was a reference earlier to the social question that we need to understand and with which the labor question is linked. The fact that most of our labor communities emerge from Dalit Bahujan communities, whereas most of those who hold power and who are, if you will, the ruling classes or dominant classes come from a very different background is something we cannot ignore. And this sort of comes up in the way in which migrant laborers or laborers more generally relate to the state, or in fact not relate to the state. Another aspect that I think is crucial for having brought us to where we are is our understandings. And when I say our, I mean those who are in positions of privilege and dominance, if you will. Understandings of the nature of labor and the idea that labor is fixed. And of course, we know that when it comes to thinking about labor in this country, labor is not fixed. It's a hugely mobile population. But the disjuncture that we see is a recognition that labor is not fixed doesn't necessarily come with the recognition that the social protections, the social rights that that should be made available cannot therefore be fixed. Our procedures of accessing social rights tend to be based on an imagination that labor will remain or is in one place, whereas, as we know, in fact, that's not the case. So if I think one had thought about portability of social rights, what we have heard in the last few days in terms of one nation, one ration, I think those sorts of ideas, I think it's just too little too late. Portable social rights would have perhaps been one way of addressing the very, very pressing concerns that labor has. I think linked to this is the failure of the Indian state and of the Indian ruling classes to think about labor as citizens. And I think that comes up again and again. We've never really thought about, and the Indian state also has never really thought about labor in terms of citizenship. And I think in some respect, we must also take responsibility for the way we've written about labor. We haven't really, linked questions of labor with questions of citizenship. And I'm thinking here in terms of such basic aspects of citizenship as voting. So in a country where so many millions of people are crisscrossing the country in search of work, voting is an act that is incredibly fixed in place. You can only vote where you are registered. And that, of course, is meaningless for so many people who are moving around town and country in search of work. So for them, voting would mean having to go back home, wherever home would be, for that one day in order to cast their vote. And of course, a lot of migrant workers do that. They do go back home to cast their vote, and then they come back, and sometimes they do it, they pay for all those journeys themselves. But the point is that, some sort of allowing migrant workers to vote, a version of postal vote or a version of sort of long distance vote would have probably made them count more than what we've seen at the moment. And that brings me to the final point about how urban governance links with questions of labor precarity. There are absolutely no ways in which labor is represented in the day-to-day urban governance of the cities, of the neighborhoods, of the areas where they live. And that also is, I think, points to our failure in terms of thinking about labor as citizens. So I think what I'm trying to say is that in addition to the actual framework of labor laws, the ideas about labor have left a lot to have resulted in our present conundrum. In the last few months, where we would have expected some sort of perhaps solidarity from members of middle classes, with the condition that migrant laborers are facing, what you instead see is the hashtag #MeTooMigrant, which in some ways, instead of solidarity with the migrant workers, is a way of appropriating the very real struggles, the very hardships, the kind of pain that migrant workers are going through. And I think that brings me back to the point I started with, the social distance between labor and the state, the social distance between labor and those who control the state, I think is what has brought us to the present position. It need not have been like this. There have been critical junctures where we could have taken very different pathways, but that was not something that we did. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for these very, very, very valuable comments, Indrajit. I think what you said about the social distance actually, which has appeared between the migrants and the state, is such a profound observation, and this is what we are seeing. I actually wanted to come in and turn our attention to the question of women's labor also at this point. And we are seeing that the state now believes that economic revival is possible only by further weakening of labor protections. And many states have used ordinances to go down that path. Within that larger context, the question of gender and labor has also assumes a very urgent relevance because of the extraordinary ordinary scale of decline in women's employment, which we have seen between 2004-5 to 2017-18. And we are seeing the impact of shock of contracting economy. But I'd like to ask you and turn to the question which Atul somewhere said, that in states imagining of the lockdown or responding to the question of or dealing with the pandemic, workers were not in that imagining. And I would further add that women workers were completely out of the sight of the state. There were absolutely no provisions for women workers, not only for them to survive or get past the lockdown, but also in terms of their travel, in terms of rebuilding. So I'd like to ask you, Ravi, you have looked at a question of gender and labor, and also the numbers, the declining numbers of women in labor force. How do you see the new regime of labor, which is actually where number of labor protections are folding up? What impact would you think will have on women's labor? How do you interpret it for women?
Yeah, so let me, well, there are two separate issues here, and I think it's might be useful to deal with both of them. Mm-hmm. One is to talk about the impact of the pandemic itself on the working population and on women in general, and then to talk about the changes, and to contextualize the changes in labor law in that within that broader framework. So as we know, as far as the pandemic is concerned, and here we are really talking about not the pandemic as such, but the lockdown. Yeah. The lockdown has affected almost the entire, and this also brings me to Atul's point, the entire universe of informal work, the entire universe. So we are really talking about something like 85 to 90% of the working class in India, and data also shows that the CMI's data, which they've analyzed the consumption data, and we saw a study some 3 days ago, which shows very clearly that 80% of households have experienced significant declines in consumption, and of course have no savings to cope with the crisis and so on. And similarly, obviously, I mean, this decline in consumption is because of lack of income, lack of wages, lack of employment. So it's a very, very severe crisis. Now, this severe crisis in order to overcome this situation, this is not a crisis. I do not believe that this crisis lends itself to what people call a V-shaped recovery. Coming out of a crisis of this kind is going to be extremely protracted. That's number one. Number two, the major problem is going to be the problem of demand. That's because external demand, which almost 30% of GDP, is going to take extraordinarily long time to revive. So it's a question of basically somehow stimulating and reviving demand. We know what the government of India has done in the last few days. It has announced a stimulus package which is less than 1% of GDP. And it has announced a medium-term reform package which basically mostly regurgitates the old reforms, which are already announced from 2016-17 onwards, with some new, some new sets of changes which is announced. So there is nothing in the offing which can help in reviving India's economy in the next 6 months to a year. What it has put in place is a set of the labor law changes. As you know, there was a prototype recommendation made by the central government that states need to respond to attracting, and in a time where actually the question is of actually reviving capacities, the state wants to attract investments, and both domestic and international investments, through lengthening of the labor day, through demolishing labor laws, and so on. I mean, it's from an economic standpoint of view, from a labor economist standpoint of view, from an aggregate economic standpoint of view, this is a bizarre response to an extremely serious crisis, the major manifestation of which will be in the form of a demand contraction. And nothing has been done. 0.8, just about 0.8% of GDP going into demand. So we are in for a deep, this means that the crisis is going to be very protracted. And this is, let me be very clear about this. All the analysis that I have done, looking at labor law flexibilization and impact on employment, impact on growth, and my own work, my papers in 2016, Adil Bhattacharya's paper, Atul's papers, all of us, the NCUS, if you look at this 2009 report, all of us have argued that the liberalization of labor laws does not lend itself to either higher employment or higher growth scenarios. And this is something which has to be, there is a great amount of literature in it, and we need to drill this in. So if you look at this, basically the direction in which the government is going, and the kind of labor law changes that it has recommended to the states to bring about have absolutely nothing in them which can revive the economy, either in the short to medium term. The crisis itself is a medium term to long term crisis. It's probably going to last forever. The Bank of England says this is the most serious crisis UK has faced since 1776. We are now predicting a 3% decline in global GDP. But it has not sunk in that in our policy circles that this is the nature of seriousness of the crisis. Now, when a crisis of this kind happens, and when demand constricts, and when there is a very severe quantity rationing of employment, all the data that we have from Indian states, cross-sectional data, time series data, tells us that it is basically the weaker sections, and particularly women, whose employment declines very precipitously. So as it is, we've had an 18 percentage point decline in female labor force participation over the last 2 decades or so. And this is going to exacerbate in the times to come. So we are going to see very sharp rising inequalities in a period, by the way, where overall labor force so this is a different kind of inequality that we're going to see. Till now, male workforce participation rates have been more or less stable. Female workforce participation rates have been declining. In the next 2 to 3 years, we are going to see extreme constriction of overall employment. And within that extreme constriction of overall employment, we're going to see very sharp declining rates of workforce participation of women, and also a sharper impact on their wages and earnings. And here again, I'm speaking of about the bottom 8 to 9 deciles of women in the workforce, not the top 10, the top decile, which is mostly urban and highly educated and highly skilled.
So, because I was looking acutely at the time, I also wanted to bring in both staying with the very important question that Navsharan has raised, but also looking ahead, because I think that the sense of deep foreboding that all our discussions are weighed down by, I think is extremely sobering and is correct, because we need to acknowledge the problem. But I felt that I wanted you all to kindly say that assume you had the authority to change things around. What is it that you feel that the Indian state needs to do at this moment? It's really there, and also staying with the rights of the entire informal workforce, as Atul said, with all its differences, we have to see them together, but also very, very particularly women's work. So ideally, where should we go from here? I wanted to request each of you to give a brief set of prescriptions, even if they are unrealistic, because I think we need to break through our imagination. If we only propose that which we think this government is going to listen to, then we might as well just stop the seminar here and I wanted to leave a little time at the end, because they're very, very thoughtful questions that our audience is sending in, and we needed a little time for that as well. So, Jon, you've heard very patiently all of us, and what would you prescribe?
Well, in the first place, a small correction. Of course, the women will continue to be working, but they will be back to the status of helpers, a classical position, because helpers are often not paid for their labor performance. And that has been the classical approach to how to make use of labor power, which is with the female part of the population. They will be back to unpaid labor, which can be as taxing as paid labor, of course, if not more. But secondly, the way out of the crisis, so to say. And if I look at the faces in these panels, many of you have already made very valuable suggestions how it can be, if not solved, at least alleviated the crisis. But that is all under the imagination that the state will be responsive to those suggestions, and that the state will do as is recommended. I doubt, because the state has basically looked at labor as a commodity. And all of a sudden, we see them turning up on the roads with human faces as human beings. And that is, of course, a scenario which the state wants to ignore. Labor should behave as a commodity. Labor should not insist on citizen rights, rights of citizenship. Labor should perform, labor should serve, but labor should have no rights. That is very clear. And the alternative, all of us have similar ways to alternatives, but that alternative was already formulated about 2 decades ago by the then National Commission of Enterprises in the unorganized sector, chaired by Arjun Sengupta. Let me remind you, with all what we have said about the state, that report, a magnificent report, because it showed the alternative to look at labor as human beings, to look at labor as an important part of the total population to look at labor in their dignity, in their identity. It was swept under the carpet by a state which was different from the present government, but it was swept under the carpet by the Congress government. And Manmohan Singh spoke out very harshly against the members of that commission. I think we still need to put on record the history of that report and what went on and what did not materialize a response from the government, from the state then, to an alternative way of progress than the current one. Because let me remind you, in approaching the state, in imagining the state, in the reform package, which Ravi has already talked about, the principles are set out. The reform package will be on self-reliance, the frame of self-reliance, as the Prime Minister has already clearly said. It will be on privatization, and it will be on small government. These are the tenets, these are the principles of neoliberalism. And it is in that direction that the state, current state also, and the former state wants to move ahead. In that direction, there will be no solution to the problem of the laborers face today, because the social question is not acknowledged in that approach. Labor is a commodity. Labor is not meant to become citizens. Labor should be anonymous. Quite rightly, Renana has said, labor is kept unidentified, not by oversight, but is meant to remain anonymous. It is meant to remain undocumented. There have been some recommendations how the problem of migrant labor could be alleviated by registering them on their arrival in the city or other sites of employment in the countryside also, by registering them. Underlying that recommendation is, of course, then that the care of the state could reach out to those migrants. In the reform packet, a new initiative by the Home Secretary, under direction of the close associate of the Prime Minister, Amit Shah, the Home Secretary has made a proposal, an initiative, to register a national register for migrant labor, a national migrant information system. Why am I scared of that proposal? It is not a proposal to benefit labor. It's a proposal to keep labor under surveillance. What we are at the moment seeing is a transformation to a surveillance state, not to care, but to control and to discipline. So in that mode of capitalist production we have been talking about, which is neoliberal, in that mode, the role attached to labor is to remain floating, to remain going around, not to settle down, not to get organized, not to claim for rights. In other words, the problem is a political one. How to solve the problem of this crisis? It cannot be solved in an economic way, only or mainly, and also certainly not in a social way. The political response has to be, the response has to be a political one. With whom do you side? With whom do you side? Those who benefit from the current system of neoliberalism, or those who are the victims of it? And it's very clear that labor, and footloose labor in particular, is the prime victim of the regime that is going on.
Thank you so much, Jon. And I think we'll all remember, I think both your reminder that this is not something that happened over just the last 6 years. There is a history of successive governments which have denied informal workers their rights. And also that the purpose of the state is, the objective of the state is not to care but to control. And I think that's truly sobering. Renana, where would you take your answer to those two questions at this stage of our discussion?
Well, I first would like to focus on women workers. And I think just to remind us that women workers are of two types. One is the wage workers, and the wage workers are those with the lowest earnings, the most manual work. As soon as technology comes in, they're out. And what has been referred to by Ashwini as the sticky floor, there is a sticky floor where they're always stuck. And this already is there. It's not something that's going to happen before or after a pandemic. The second type of workers are the self-employed, and only 20% of the self-employed, the women actually control or are the main worker. The rest, they are quote unquote unpaid family workers. And remember, 80% of workers are in the rural areas. So I actually want to challenge this point that women's labor force participation is declining. I think we've had enough studies challenging this NSS's statistics, and mostly in the feminist economist circles, and nobody else seems to take any notice of that. But there's study after study after study showing that there is not a decline. In fact, there's a decline in the NSS collection of statistics, of data, where they are not asking the questions properly. So that big unpaid family labor, the livestock producers, the farmers, or even people like domestic workers, they're all not counted. So is there a decline? I don't think there is a decline. It was low, and the studies we have done shows that at least in the rural areas, the women's participation is over 50%, something like 54, 55%. So of course, that's also not 100%, and I'd like to come back to that. And just finishing this issue on women's work, I think there's certain parts of women's work which are particularly women's work, which will see a decline, but not because they're women, but just that type of work. 60% of urban workers, women workers, are home-based workers. And home-based work is going to see a decline because demand is going to see a decline. Agriculture, that's where the maximum workers are. Is agriculture going to see a decline? I don't know. Is livestock and milk going to see a decline? I don't know. So whether there's going to be more of a decline, I think there's a big question mark. But what we will continue to face, and what we face now, is that women's work is not a priority. The general ethos among policymakers and everywhere is that women are particularly home workers, and they just work, it's subsidiary, they might have to, etc. But women's work is not important, and that is a much longer struggle. That women are working already, they must be recognized, they must be given all the other benefits that are given to workers. So I think that longer struggle of women as worker, one, and the other longer struggle of sharing the housework, which is something that has not moved a jot, I think, in India. So that longer struggle will remain, and whether it is pandemic or after the pandemic, I think we're facing that now during the pandemic, where everybody is home and women are doing all the work. We don't see any sharing of work, by the way, because we've been doing studies and we see the men are at home, but are they sharing work? No. So, so that's just the longer struggle, and I wanted to put that on the table. What should be done? I agree with Ravi's analysis that that demand is going to be a big issue, and so what needs to be done, whether it will be or not, we don't see any signs of it, is put more cash in the hands of people. So find ways to increase people's employment like Narega, but also find ways to just put cash in the hands of people. They did a bit of that with the Jandhan accounts and some minor building and construction workers and a little bit in pensions, but that's hardly enough. If we really want to build up demand, and that's the only way to go forward, we really, really need to be putting cash in the hands of the people. And I think that's the main solution that I would pursue.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that until we look at demand and growth of demand from below, there is no solution. Atul, where would you take your answers to these two questions?
Sorry, I'll be brief in the interest of time, though I wanted to say a fair bit on the changes in the labor laws. Just a quick aside on that whatever has been done in the 3 states, clearly it's very complicated and there's not a simplification. In fact, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat changes in labor laws, itself putting them together and what is applicable and what is not applicable is going to be a task which will take months for us to figure out. So, I mean, clearly the intent is not what they are saying about simplification. But I want to focus on the larger question that you had asked, what do we do? And I wanted to put that question in some perspective. In order to address the question of what do we do, there are 2 aspects or 2 things that I thought we should be thinking about. One, what is being done and our understanding of what is being done and how it is being done. Now, if you look at what is being done, it's interesting that the emphasis on what is being done has nothing to do with actually the facts or the reality. It's actually of how the interpretation or how the alternative or the common sense that has been created. So it has nothing to do with the facts. I mean, in fact, when the labor law changes happened recently post-COVID, I went to the investment sites, which I've never gone, to look at what are the investment consultancy firms telling us in terms of, investments in China and India at this point of time. And I don't have the time, but if I were to quote in detail from the investment sites and not tell you that these are investment sites, you'll be surprised. I mean, they make, comments like India's manufacturing labor is more competitive when compared to China. In 2000, I'm quoting from there. In 2014, the average cost of manufacturing in labor was this much. In India, it was this much. While labor costs in India are much lower, what adds to the cost in India is India's expensive transportation, power, water costs, etc. So in fact, the whole issue of infrastructure cost vis-a-vis labor cost and the key issue of competitiveness between India and China having nothing to do with labor cost is actually something that the investment consultancy firms are saying. But when it comes to the discourse here and the initiatives of policy, whether you see it, in terms of the dominant media or whatever the government is saying, we are being sold this idea that this will bring about investment, if as a result of deregulating labor. And I think it is the idea of the common sense or the new common sense that is being built. One important aspect of that is that everyone knows that the labor has suffered the most in this pandemic. And now the onus of making adjustment to deal with the crisis is also on those who have suffered the most. So that's quite interesting, that in a way quite sick, that actually those who are the victims are held responsible in some ways for the experience or for their victimization. And therefore they have to pay additional cost in overcome their conditions. So the sort of taking away of minimum wages and the rest of the story about deregulating the labor markets is something which will be being done at the cost of the labor, having nothing to do with the facts on the ground. I mean, Ravi was mentioning a lot of work about it in terms of, whether when they talk about Inspector Raj, we already know that those are factually not correct because the factory inspections have fallen exponentially in the last 15 to 20 years. So all the arguments that are being made in the defense of the policy changes have nothing to do with actually the facts on the ground as provided by the government. Yet the government and the larger discourse, the larger noise that is created around it, is able to successfully carry forward with it. And I think it is that we need to look at and saying, whom are we addressing to deal with that challenge? So it is, in a sense, the key mechanism through which these changes are being brought about, we need to understand in order to find a role for ourselves, or saying, what do we do? I think there can be two key pillars around which, there's lots of insight here in the panel and outside in terms of, what the focus is. I mean, Ravi's mentioned about the issue of demand and the rest of it. But I think in terms of the larger collective, which is dealing with labor and labor rights and in defense of the working people, the issue really is not for us to make a suggestion in terms of how growth will be restored. I mean, because the state understands how growth will be restored. As Harsh, in your immense work, the whole issue of the entitlement of citizens and the entitlement of poor citizens is the key focus that needs to be, that has to be not brought about into the discourse. I mean, the state is in fact using this crisis, and there is enough evidence. I mean, I think that in order to anticipate what the state is doing, one has to do is read Edward Simmons on his work on the reconstruction of Kutch in Gujarat. And I mean, since the regime is similar, what was implemented in Gujarat is being implemented in India, which in one line is that taking this as an opportunity, taking this pandemic as an opportunity to bring about changes that you could not been able to politically deal with or implement over the last many years. That's exactly what was done in the reconstruction of Kutch. That's being attempted here. So I think that, one is this whole larger issue of entitlement of citizens, within which, our demands need to be put. And this is an opportunity for us, because there are segments beyond the working class also, which now feel that the working class has been wronged. So I think this is an opportunity for us to establish an alternative discourse, which appears to be legitimate in this point of time. So rather than just addressing the state and seeking certain benefits, probably if we were to address this larger set of citizens and create, this is the moment to say that if you deal with the pandemic, this is the Citizens Charter, which includes, of course, in focus the vulnerabilities and the precarity and the immense human tragedy of the working people as the key focus. But that Citizens Charter approach, mobilizing public opinion around that. And I think the second pillar, which is very crucial in terms of overcoming the pandemic, as well as safeguarding our lives in future, including, is this whole issue of public health and workers' right, or poor people's right to access to health. I mean, I think that these are two key pillars, which can be, of course, the second one can again be linked with not only about your working status, but your entitlement as citizen. So I think in terms of mobilizing, or in terms of, intervening in the current crisis, the state has chosen its path. It's now time for us to choose our vantage point or pressure points around which we mobilize. And apart from the immense humanitarian work that people here, on this panel and outside have been doing, and in supporting people to overcome this human tragedy. But I think we should also start thinking in terms of what are the key slogans or key emphasis that we are going to sort of build our response around. And not only we suggest measures which bring back growth, which in any case, state has chosen its mechanism of how it will bring about growth. We also need to sort of bring back the rights of the poor and the rights of the citizen to focus, given the pandemic and the context of the pandemic. It's a strange world that we are living in, that regulatory, this pandemic has exposed the cracks in the system, so to say. And the response to the cracks is actually not dealing with the vulnerabilities, but in fact, increasing the vulnerabilities. So, you look at look at the dominant discourse. The dominant discourse is actually inverting upside everything down, and is not even responding to the crisis that we are talking about, because it thinks that that will get automatically resolved. And I think our biggest challenge is to bring this agenda back into national discourse before we can seek specific policy input for either a particular segment of the working force or for us, those who are most vulnerable.
Thank you so much, Atul. Labor rights is part of a much larger citizens' charter. We're running out of time, but Priyanka and Indrajit, and then I hope we could take a few questions. Navsharan will present what the audience is asking. Yes, please, Priyanka.
Great. There's several things one could do, but I'll focus on two. I think the first one would be to think about the sort of concentration of power we have seen in the government system and in the executive arms into people in particular. How do you open channels of critical feedback, not just from movements, activists, unions, working people's struggles? Of course, all of that is important. But today I would say that it is important to even take critical feedback from industry. And that is not happening. This is based on our conversations with small and medium enterprise owners, even the homegrown companies that are trying to sort of compete in the global value chain. What we see that there is a much greater convergence of interest that there was before. Where is the feedback coming from as far as industry is concerned today? And this is what we understand from many people that we spoke to, is that all of these associations that sort of the state kind of takes its feedback from are extremely sycophantic spaces, actually. It is all about sort of praising the government because there is real fear of witch hunt if you don't do that, which means that critical feedback from industry is also not happening. What we understood from industry today is also very similar to what a labor rights person or anyone with basic macroeconomic sense would say. Demand is absolutely crucial at this point. Industry is telling us that for the next 1 year, just give money to people, focus on their health, because without that production, it's a demand problem more than a supply problem. Production is not going to go back. The support that we require from industry, from state, is of infrastructure. It's sort of dismantling PSUs as they are planning to do. And in fact, investors have told us very clearly that the reason I'm not going to UP is not because the Factories Act requires me to set up a toilet. The reason I'm not going to UP is it's complete anarchy and I'm afraid for my life, and that's become worse under the current regime. So this kind of assault, the discursive assault on labor laws, it's a lot more easier to fight right now, because even industry like Azim Premji came out and talked about how labor is not the top constraint, and other kind of industry players are saying that if actually India gains the reputation of being a sort of country which has suspended all of its labor laws and gone back to the 18th century, we'll be boycotted in the international market. And so it's damaging. It penalizes companies that are actually trying to do proper compliance, and then it's incentivizing completely unscrupulous industries, and that's creating perversities in the domestic market. So how do you get this kind of feedback is I think one thing that I would kind of focus on. The second thing, I think a good opening that has happened because of this pandemic is a lot of things, a lot of ideas that were considered fringe ideas or foolish ideas, administratively infeasible ideas, are now being taken seriously. When it comes to universal basic income, when it comes to portability, when it comes to urban Narega, there are a lot of announcements around this. Himachal Pradesh is trying to do urban Narega. The center has made a lot of announcements. Things are happening at the state level as well. Now, these are important openings, but there is a lot of messiness as far as these things are concerned. In our approach to that, I think a few things become important. I think the first thing is that we should not kind of, the problem description. Why do people not have social security today? It's not like we lack social security laws even today. It is not an administrative problem alone. These are not issues that can be fixed through administrative fixtures, procedure, or like technology fixtures as the World Bank 8 kind of focuses on. That's not what portability is all about. There is deep troubles in how our governance is approached. It has ethnic bias, it has sedentary bias, it has very strange state and center relationships, competitive kind of state relationships, and we need to think about all of that. Otherwise, let's say something like one ration one nation, one ration card won't fly, because that's not how it works. Every state has its own list of poor. It gets its money from the center. There are so many complications. So universality, as we are talking about today, is not just an administrative thing. It is actually a value. And it needs that we reorder the relationship of the labor with state and society. First of all, the other kind of thing, the important thing is to de-link social security, to de-link public provisioning from wage and also from work. Because one of the things that we're going to see is vast amounts of wagelessness happening, which was already happening before the pandemic, and it's going to be deepened afterwards. So we need broad-based kind of inclusion measures, and not ones where the burden of proof is on the poor to prove that they are legitimate, that they fit narrow, complicated, unrationalized definitions of who's eligible, and all of this quagmire of documentation, that has sort of sprung up in the last few years. So that, I think, delinking from wage, delinking from work, broad-based, the burden of proof has to shift away from the poor, who should not be having to run from pillar to post to prove legitimacy of his or her existence. The second thing is delinking from domicile, kind of moving away from a very colonial era imagination of legitimacy based on residence. And this whole idea that the whole country's governance is actually structured on local identity. You have to continuously prove your local identity to be able to access anything, and Aadhaar didn't change that, because that's a social practice. That's a governmentality sort of practice. How do we move away? The idea of legitimacy moves away from residence to presence, and presence, even if it is irregular in nature. And that is something that labor requires today. And I think the one more thing that I would add to it is, when it comes to registration, information, these are tricky issues. We need some of it for formalization. Formalization is not a panacea, neither is registration, and registration does not alone lead to formalization. These are complicated discussions. But if there is to be information collected, can it be locally owned? Can we go back to the idea of decentralization and sharing of power with your local bodies? Not because these are not spaces that don't have their issues of power, but these are spaces where people can struggle, people can negotiate. An Adivasi woman can struggle with her panchayat. She can probably come together with 10 other workers and go to the municipality. She can't question the agenda of the center as easily. So devolution back to local governance and ownership of the data in these kind of spaces, which also allows it to be a lot more dynamic and not that static, which is kind of required when people are moving around all the time. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Priyanka. A lot of very, very thoughtful ideas. Indrajit, just at the end.
Yeah, very quickly. Just to reiterate, in fact, what has just been said, I think we can't emphasize how crucial universal basic income is at a time like this. And when I say universal basic income, it is really universal. So not targeted towards any section of the population, etc. But I think at this stage, it just needs to be universal in order to overcome bureaucratic hurdles, as well as perhaps to build the social cohesion that we sadly lack. The second point, again, to reiterate what's just been said, think about social and political rights delinked from residence and linked with presence. I think that is something that we need to really internalize in the policy as well as the public narrative. Linking social and political rights with presence rather than residence. And finally, since you asked us, Harsh, to think beyond limitations of the existing government, I do think one could consider ways in which labor could be organized across the country, not in a necessarily laborist, trade unionist sort of a way, but which, in a way that is much more responsive to the flexible conditions within which
Hello, I think Indrajit's got a little frozen, but yes, thank you for putting out some really sharp ideas. I know we're running out of time, but Navsharan, we've had a lot of very interesting questions. I thought if you could just lay out some of.
Would you allow me to give a small comment to what you said?
Okay, sure.
Seeing these people on the road as fugitives.
Yes.
I invite you to turn it around and to realize that they have turned their back on what their mainstay mainstay is supposed to be. It's not only that they are chased out of the cities and their work sites, they're chased out for fear of contamination is the crisis, but also impurity as a dangerous class.
Mm-hmm.
But now they have turned their back. They walk off. That is agency. That is agency. Do not only look at them as victims, as helpless people. They insist on their rights. They insist on their dignity. And that's what they are doing by their tortuous walk back home.
Yeah, it's a very painful but very powerful assertion of agency. I think, and that's something that we should always remember. Navsharan, if you could place a few questions that have come from the audience.
But there's a question for Jean asking about the rural sector and what happens to the agriculture labor in such a situation when a whole lot of migrants from urban sector are migrating back to rural areas. So how do we see the impact on this? Also a question to Jean on bonded and forced laborers and implications for them in these times. There's an interesting question about we are seeing a race to the bottom and who is going to be the quote unquote winner of this race. So I'd like to turn it to Jean for his brief comments, and then we move on to.
Yeah, if I can just add a few more, because
Okay, sure, please do.
Yeah, so they've said that, some people have said that what positive reforms can be brought about for the welfare and rights of migrant workers. Can technology help? The suspension of labor laws at one stroke will mostly impact the formal or the organized sector. How is it that the Indian trade unions have been so completely ineffective in responding to the informal sector? The constitution talks about living wages. How can that become a reality? The new laws and ordinances will end up controlling women's bodies and sexuality even more. With unsanitary environment and working conditions, women will be compelled to compress and compromise on their sexual and reproductive health rights. And this will be a gross violation. Is work from home relevant for migrant workers when they're back to their home state? So these are some, certain states are trying to hold back migrants and not allowing them to go home in their hour of crisis. Are migrant laborers being converted in effect to bonded laborers? I think these are just some questions, and I'm sorry that there were 50 odd, and I wish we had more time. But so in your last closing comments, literally sort of 30 seconds each, if you all could, or 1 minute, if you could just address anything that you heard and would like to respond to. Can I go on to Priyanka, please? Yeah, you're off the mobile. You're off the.
Sorry, I'm audible now.
Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, I've just spoken about what is the sort of positive agenda that we can go forward. There are lots of ideas out there already. I mean, instead of dismantling PSUs, you kind of, impose wealth tax, you impose inheritance tax. What needs to be done in terms of creating equality in the country, land, labor, forests? The agenda is all there. The ideas is all there. The point is that, are we bringing it together, and are, again, those channels of critical feedback available or not? And I think as far as gender is concerned, we know, from the work of feminist economists and ethnographers, every macroeconomic shock has an impact on women's work. It intensifies it. It makes it more excruciating. It makes life a lot harder for them. That's something you can see in their time use. That's something you can see in their affective structures, in the amount of intense feelings, love, care, violence that they have to subsume. So the economy has a very clear relationship with women's work and their existence. And if we don't kind of deal with the structural issues that have surfaced very clearly during this pandemic, those of us who care about the gender question should know that this will have a very, very deep impact.
Thank you. Atul?
I'm just saying that Professor Breman has put it so perfectly. I'll just add a line saying that we need to think about ways in which we can strengthen the agency of the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerable. And we'll have to think of all ways, and in fact, that should be the focus of our conversation, how we can strengthen that, rather than focusing on how state can either deal with the immediate crisis or how the state can, deal with, specific issues that the pandemic has exposed in front of us. Focusing on the agency of the poor in this crisis and treating this crisis as an opportunity for us to strengthen this agency is something that would make a difference. I think the cracks in the society have been so deeply exposed by this pandemic that if we re-energize ourselves, I still see a lot of hope to make that difference.
Thanks so much. Assertion resistance. I was reading an article that the migration, the reverse migration, is really an act of resistance, and a very profound act of resistance in the way that Jean Breman spoke about. Renana, would you like to give some last thoughts and also respond to any of the questions?
Just quickly responding to two questions. One is that labor laws will affect the this sort of suspension of labor laws will affect the informal sector, the unorganized sector. One is the minimum, just a few examples, but just two examples. One is the Minimum Wages Act. The Minimum Wages Act applies to unorganized labor, and you suspend it, and you, in many places, Minimum Wages Act is an aspirational act. So people aspire to that minimum wage or fight for that minimum wage. Suspending it will cause even more exploitation. The other is that suspending the Trade Union Act, there are actually many trade unions, including SEVA, in the unorganized sector, but there are many very small local trade unions, all of whom are able to negotiate because of the Trade Union Act. So I don't think labor laws will only affect the suspension of labor laws will only affect the formal sector. It will have a very, very difficult time for the informal sector. The second point that that was raised was, can technology help? I think if we are thinking of a basic income, whether universal or to an extent targeted, we don't really have the technology completely to do it now, in the sense that it exists, but there are huge bottlenecks. In rural areas, how do you reach money? The bank branches are so far, the ATMs don't work, etc. So I think that there's a lot of technology that can be and should be really put into service to make sure that cash reaches people. And that's where all the research should go.
Okay. Ravi, some last closing responses.
Thanks, Harsh. I'll just focus on these going forward issues.
Yes.
And I think two sets of issues which people have talked about. Basically, first of all, going forward, we are really speaking of going forward within the whole structure of varieties of capitalisms. And of course, within the whole structure of a constitution and international contracts that we have. The two broad sets of pillars that we've talked about. One is the citizenship pillar. How do we move workers and other people and make claims on citizenship? But the other, I think, the more urgent issue on which I think we haven't perhaps been able to devote enough time is building up the claims as workers and on workers' rights at this juncture. I agree with the comment that Jan made that actually the genie is out of the bottle. As far as migrant workers is concerned, it's really out of the bottle. There are crores of migrant workers who have been on the move, and their relationship with their employers will never be the same again. There are also, by the way, there are hundreds and thousands of organizations who are helping them move, who are providing succor to them. This is such an enormous change for someone who's been working with migrant organizations for the past 15 to 20 years, as I have been. The full large number of organizations. So I think that it's rebuilding the workers' agenda where we need to focus on. Jan was kind enough to talk about the NCUS work. And I think the two big takeaways from the NCUS work, which are still important, despite this whole question of surveillance and all that. One is the question of a universal social security number, which gives an identity to a worker and which plugs him into an entitlement for social security. And I think that is something which is still we need to focus on. That's number two, the fact that every worker must have a direct relationship with an employer. There should be, so the question, particularly in the organized sector, that there should be no go-betweens, no contractor, no nothing. There has to be a registration of an employment relationship as far as at least the organized sector is concerned. And then building on it, we go on to look at the right to form associations, minimum wage, and so on and so forth. So I think the whole structure, the working class agenda now has to be structured from bottoms up. I think fortunately the central trade unions are also recognizing it. If you look at the agenda for the May 22nd strike, it looks like nothing that has preceded it in the past. This is a direction in which we need to push, and I think there will be a change irrespective of the kind of change that the government and the state would like to have us believe. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks, Harsh.
Thank you so much, Ravi. And Jon, you really have the last word here in our discussion.
Well, a short comment only, given the time. But my immediate sentiment is with the people when they reach home, when they come back. What do?
Mm-hmm.
They come back not only penniless, they bring no savings, as the providers should do when they come back from their recurrent trek. They bring no savings, which keeps the household afloat. Not only that, very often they have already left in debt. They are, many of them have contracted loans and that force them to go out. It's not only lack of employment, it's also a deficit of household income, which forces them out and which they can only solve by contracting debt. Do not underestimate the dependency once they are back home. Their moneylender, their usurious moneylender will come around and collect the monthly payment, which is not there. What happens then? The crisis in front of us is enormous. Think of the fabric of the household, of the migrant household, which has seen members depart for over 2 to 3 generations now to go off and come back. But do they always bring the savings? What is the relationship? What is the cohesion within the household, between the members of the household? They are also subjected to the perils of capitalism, of consumption. And think of that book, a kind of novel, which you may have read, of Aman Sethi, A Free Man. He is a tramp. He's a loner. He goes out and rarely goes back. And if he goes back, he does not bring savings. The household, the working class household, is broken up by its own members and going off in different directions and having different demands. So we should indeed follow up by finding out what happens now.
Thank you so much, Jon. I think your reminder, firstly, about what happens to the worker who returns home, in what conditions. And, you know, I've been reading and listening to accounts where actually they have borrowed for the first time from the family back home because they were in such a situation of desperation now. And this was the first time they had to, and in the conditions of penury that the family was. And the unpaid debts here and the unpaid debts there, and your value in terms of being able to support and provide for your family, and the fear of the pandemic and all of that in addition. I also wanted to briefly draw attention to the people who have not left and who have nowhere to go. And I work a lot of my time with homeless people. And homeless single men. I just about 2 or 3 days back, I was sitting in Yamuna Pushta. They again, like fugitives, they ran away from, they were pulled away, they were locked up in schools, they said, which were worse than jails. And they've come, they're hiding from the police in pipes. They're living inside pipes. and I spoke to them, and their desperation, because they said the only work that we used to have was in wedding parties and in dhabas. None of that work is going to be there. What is going to happen to us in the coming months? We met also in our food distribution in places like Nangloi, people who worked in very small enterprises, foot footwear, etc., where there are 10 workers, 15 workers, where they themselves say that the employer has no capacity to pay them in these circumstances. And they have been reduced for the first time in their lives to lining up for 2 hours, 3 hours for a small ladle of cooked food. And the state is definitely going to tire of this distribution of food. And then what happens to them? What happens to the breakdown of whatever food charities we have? What happens even to the solidarities that Ravi spoke about? And I've been really touched by the numbers of people I see on the streets helping others. But that is going to also weary and come to an end. What happens to people's lives after that? So I think that there is that we are. I've seen signs of. Of mass hunger of the kind that I saw as a district officer occasionally in mass drought situations. To see that kind of desperation of mass hunger in the city. In the city, hunger was always a heartbeat away for this segment of people, but you always had some way of earning some money or a gurdwara to go to or somewhere else. Today, hunger is part of the everyday reality, and of very large numbers, 2 kilometer lines, 3 kilometer lines of people waiting for food. So there's the crisis of the worker who has left, the crisis of the worker who actually has nowhere else to go. And I think that we have to bear all of that in mind. It has been a very, very, very heart-rending conversation, but I think it has been a conversation of solidarity. It has also been a conversation where there are moments in history where they say speaking the truth is the most revolutionary act that one can do. And I think this was an afternoon or a morning for those of us who are from overseas of truth telling, of very painful truth telling. And I think that with the truth telling is the possibility one day of uh, finding some kind of avenue or pathway to a more just India and a more just world. So let us end, if we despair too much with remembering something that Martin Luther King said. He said the arc of history is long, but in the end, it bends towards justice. Uh, our worry is how long is that arc of history going to take before it bends towards justice, and how can we together fight so that it does bend sooner within our lifetimes to justice. So thank you all of you for sharing this very moving and insightful set of observations this afternoon. Thank you.